Vineyard Boise. We're glad you're joining us this morning. My name is Mitchell. I'm the media director here, and I just want to share with you all the ways that you can engage in the service this morning. So we have 3 ways that you can engage. First is Facebook. Just head over to our Facebook page and you can watch live and interact with other members of the church as well as some of the leadership team. You can also start a watch party and share the service with all your friends and family. Make sure you're following the page so you'll get notified when we go live. Second is YouTube. YouTube makes it super easy to pull up the service on Apple TVs, Roku's, and smart TVs. Just open up the YouTube app and go to our channel and you're all set. This may be an easier option if you're wanting to watch just as a family or just not wanting to see the comments. Again, subscribe to our channel and you'll get notified when we go live. Third is our newest option at vineyardboise.org/live. We've added a lot of new features to the live platform on our website to help you better engage. In addition to a great chat feature for the congregation, you can also ask for prayer from our leadership team and then pray with someone in the private chat window. There's also a built-in Bible and easy access to our devotions and some other great tools. Just go to vineyardboise.org/live or click the Watch Live button on the website or the app. If you're new to Vineyard Boise, have questions, or want to connect with our leadership, we'd love to hear from you. Just fill out our online Connect card at vineyardboise.org/connect, and we'd love to get in touch with you. You can also ask for prayer by emailing prayer@vineyardboise.org. Enjoy the service.
This is the first Sunday of a new year. Welcome to 2021. Can we say, is it good? I appreciate Jesse's authenticity this morning as he was leading us in worship. And he said, you know what? It's probably not that everything is radically going to change just because the calendar changed. There's still hardships before us, but there is a God who's leading us. And we have a kind of a pattern, a rhythm in our life together as a church that in this, whenever the new calendar year rolls around, it's a good time for us to pause and kind of do an inventory and say, God, what are you doing in our midst right now? What do you want us to lean into in the coming year? It's a moment where we ask for clarity from God to say, God, we're finite people with only so much bandwidth, so much shelf space. And so what do you want us to focus on this year? So it's not like we come up with a brand new mission every year, but every year we're asking God for clarity. And so pretty typically this first Sunday after the New Year's is when we begin casting vision for where we see God taking us, where our leadership team senses after a season of prayer. So I'm going to be doing that today. It's actually not going to be self-contained to today. We're actually going to be doing this throughout the month of January. This is a kind of a month-long reset. We're calling this a reset. And so I'll start with this. I believe it's Plato that's been most credited with coining the phrase, necessity is the mother of invention. I don't know if Plato really coined that, but he's the one that's most often credited with it. But it comes from the idea that crisis can be a catalyst for needed change. Crisis can be, and often is, a catalyst for needed change. Meaning that there's things that, there's change that we're looking back over human history, and we can see that there was change that arose that wouldn't have arisen if it were not for crisis. That oftentimes it's the challenges of a moment that cause people to be inventive, to adapt, to change, because they're required to. And if everything was fine and the status quo was just, was okay, then maybe change would never be pursued or felt. There wouldn't be a felt need for it. And yet, when there's a crisis and everything's shaken and there's upheaval, we recognize there's a need for change. A few examples, just out of just our common history. Some of these more significant than others. But in the 1930s, a lady named Ruth Wakefield, she had a personal crisis in the midst of the national crisis that was known as the Great Depression. So setting is the Great Depression, and it was specifically one lady, Ruth Wakefield, she was in a crisis because what she did for her living at that time was she ran what was called a toll house. It was basically the 1930s version of an Airbnb. And she sustained her living by renting out space in her home to other people. And so part of that was hospitality, and she liked to bake cookies for these people. And she ran out of chocolate. She ran out of baker's chocolate for the cookies she was making. And so her crisis caused her to find a chocolate bar that she cut up into pieces and put into her cookie mix, thus giving us what? Chocolate chip cookies. Thank God for the crisis thank you for Ruth's crisis of 1930s, because a chocolate chip cookie is so much better than just a chocolate cookie, right? In the sports arena, 130 years ago, Dr. James Naismith, 1891 was the year. Dr. James Naismith, he was a sports coach and doctor. He was looking for a way to keep his athletes active during the cold winter months when they couldn't be outside doing the type of activity that they were normally doing. And so he took a soccer ball and he installed some wicker baskets on some poles and invented the game that we know today as basketball. Yes, and Nike has thanked him ever since as they've rolled in the millions and given us things like LeBron James. So, and then maybe on one last example, an environmental crisis that led to change. The Deepwater Horizon oil rig exploded in the Gulf of Mexico back in 2010. This is more current. Many of you were alive during this, may remember this, but this was the single largest oil spill in human history. How do you cap a fissure that is over a mile under the ocean floor or under the ocean surface? They were trying to figure out how to cap this, and so for weeks, oil was just erupting into the ocean, creating a cataclysmic disaster. And at the time, there was no technology for how to cap that. And so, on the fly, people discovered, they figured out a way to cap that. And that solution has gone on to be incorporated into all deep water drilling globally as a contingency plan, so that if something like that would happen again, there wouldn't be the same type of crisis. So now globally, that whole industry has changed in order to prevent that sort of thing. It came out of crisis. What I'd suggest to you is that right now that we are in a crisis that could lead to change that we may not have ever moved towards had things remained the same. And so it's important for us to on the one hand, acknowledge the crisis, but to also say, okay, what could develop out of this? What does God want to do? And for us as a people who are committed to following Jesus, that's the question. God, what do you want to do in the midst of this? So I'm going to be sharing with you a little bit of that today. This comes out of a season of prayer. Going back to September, every September, our leadership team takes several days where we go away to the mountains together and we spend time in prayer, just seeking God for clarity for the coming year. And so beginning with that time and then just with ongoing seasons of prayer, both personally and in corporate groups of leaders and pastors, we've just sensed some change that God's bringing. So we're going to be sharing about that over the next 4 weeks. So to do that today, I want to rewind to Mark chapter 3. And that's actually a chapter that we were studying as a church. We're working through Mark, and we actually reached Mark chapter 3 back in November. But the importance of it in our lives right now is such that I want to circle back to it and kind of hit play all over again. I want to rewind and hit play again. And so as we pick up in Mark chapter 3, it's fairly early on in Jesus' ministry, but there's a polarizing shift that's happening in his ministry, and we're just going to look at it through those lenses briefly. I'll say this, here's the polarizing shift. Jesus is becoming, on the one hand, more hated, more distrusted, more questioned, and on the other hand, he's becoming more popular, more loved. He's becoming more opposed from some fronts, and he's becoming more desired on other fronts. So we're going to pick up in Mark 3, verse 7. Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the sea, and a great crowd followed from Galilee and Judea and Jerusalem and Idumea and from beyond the Jordan and from around Tyre and Sidon. And when the great crowd heard all that he was doing, they came to him. And he told his disciples to have a boat ready for him because of the crowd, lest they crush him, for he had healed many, so that all who had diseases pressed around him to touch him. I want to suggest that this moment represents a ministry crisis in the life and the earthly ministry of Jesus. It's not a crisis in the sense that he had done anything wrong. It's not a crisis in the sense of him being burned out or devastated or disillusioned in any way, but a crisis in the sense that Jesus reached this pivotal moment where he knew that it was time for a change. He sensed that if he just kept doing things the way he would, that the mission he had come to accomplish would be limited, would be stalled out. And that if he was to reach the purposes that God had sent him for, he would have to adapt and change. This is a critical moment. And he realized that he would not see the results for which he'd been sent without change. So here's the nature of the crisis Jesus was facing. First of all, there was challenge of opposition from both the religious and the political establishment. We didn't read this verse, but the verse immediately before that one that we just read is Mark 3:6. It says, "The Pharisees went out, and they immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him." Okay? Mark says there was an alliance between the Pharisees and the Herodians. That's an unholy alliance. Those are two groups that normally don't see eye to eye on things. And yet, when it comes to Jesus, both the religious establishment of the Pharisees, the political establishment of the Herodians, they see Jesus as a threat. And so they say, let's figure out how to end him, how to quash him and his people, how to silence them, how to extinguish them. And so he's facing opposition. He was also facing the challenge of literally being crushed by human need. If you think about the need that Jesus was experiencing, what happened is word got out that there was someone who could do something about the pressing needs that people were experiencing in their lives. Whether that were spiritual need, physical need, financial need. Jesus, he fed people, he healed people, he cast out demons out of people. Whatever the nature of the brokenness that people were experiencing in a fallen world, Jesus was able to meet that need. And so, as we read the text there, it says that people are coming from all over. And if you look at the geographical places that are listed, that's not from one localized area in northern Israel. That's where Jesus, he'd been doing ministry in northern Israel. People are coming from every direction. And it got to where Jesus said, hey, get in a boat or get the boat ready so I can get out there in the water, because they were literally pressing in on him and the need was potentially going to crush him. The other nature of his need was the geographic limitation. Jesus had been traveling. We saw early on in the book of Mark that the locals wanted Jesus to stay in the town of Capernaum. He had a night of ministry, kind of a healing crusade. A lot of people's lives were transformed. And so everybody said, we should just set up a tent and just keep doing this over and over. And he said, no. After a night in prayer, he said, no, I know that I'm called to go to other towns in Galilee also. So Jesus has already been expanding geographically to not just be in Capernaum, but he's going to all other towns in northern Israel. But now we see that the need goes far beyond northern Israel. People are coming from everywhere. There's a challenge of his human limitations. We know that Jesus, theologically, we know that he was both fully God and fully man. But as a man, he didn't lean into his divinity. He experienced the same limitations we experience. So he needed sleep at night. He was finite. He couldn't be everywhere at once. He literally could not meet every need. I heard an analogy this week that as humans, it's like, the analogy was that as humans, we're like sponges and we can only hold so much water. And once we're saturated, you simply just can't hold anymore. Jesus couldn't actually meet every need. In his humanness, the human person Jesus could not meet every need, even in first century Israel, let alone the whole world. So what was the solution? In this moment where Jesus was experiencing all of these limitations, this challenge, this crisis, what was the solution? We're going to read about that in just a moment. But before we get there, I want to take you to a place in Luke that shows us what Jesus did before he got to the solution. Jesus arrived at his solution after a night spent in prayer. Luke 6:12. In these days, Jesus went out on the mountain to pray. And all night, he continued in prayer to God. Here's what this tells us. The solution to human need, the solution for for answers in the middle of crisis, for even invention in the midst of crisis. It doesn't come from within, it comes from above. Jesus spent a whole night asking the Father, God, what do I do? We see this as a pattern in Jesus' life. Abba, Father, what do I do? He brought to him the needs. He said, look, there's opposition coming from both sides. There's all these limitations I'm experiencing. What do I do? And by the end of that night, we don't know how that night played out, but by the end of that night, Jesus emerged with a new strategy. The crisis of that moment led to a new strategy. This is in the language of 2020 that we became very familiar with to the point of like, let's stop saying it. This is Jesus' pivot and adapt moment. Because the crisis caused him to pause, to take the problem to the Father, to ask for solutions, and then he pivoted and adapted. Verse 13, when he woke up he went up on the mountain. This is in the morning, after that night in prayer. And he called to them those whom he desired, and they came to him, and he appointed, and the Greek wording there, Mike pointed us out in our devotions this week, that the word is actually made. He created a new Israel, a new 12. He appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, so that they might be with him, and he might send them out to preach and to have authority and cast out demons. So again, this is the moment where Jesus pivots and adapts. What does it look like? Well, Jesus reset. This is his reset for his ministry and model in order to meet the present needs and to prepare for the future advancement of God's mission. What did he do? He refocused his energy. He rearranged his priorities. He reorganized his life, meaning his schedule, his calendar, his discretionary time, and he released others to join the mission. Okay, up until this moment, here's what Jesus' ministry looked like. Jesus would arrive in a place. People were drawn to him because they heard that he could meet present needs. He would preach. He would then heal people. And then he would move on to the next place where he would do it again. But it was pretty much a one-man show. There was people following him, but it was him and a crowd. That's the way it worked. Right now, he's going to refocus his energy. Instead of focusing on the crowd, he said, you know what? I'm going to continue to be here for the crowd, but I'm going to refocus my energy on these 12. This is the divine strategy the Heavenly Father gave him. I'm going to focus on these 12, not the whole crowd. I'm going to give more attention to these 12. He rearranged his priorities. He said, you know what? I'll continue to go from town to town, but instead of just going from town to town and encountering new groups of people everywhere I go, I'm going to take this 12 with me from town to town. I'm going to spend time with them, and we're going to debrief, and we're going to model stuff together. He reorganized his life because instead of just being Jesus out there by himself, he said, I want you to travel with me. I'm going to include you in my moment-to-moment life, not just the events when I'm publicly preaching at the synagogue or on the shore or on the mountainside. I'm going to include you in my life. I want to be with you. What does it say? It said they were to be with him and they were to be sent by him. And so that final part is that he's releasing others. That the mission moving forward is not going to be Jesus doing ministry one man to a crowd. It's going to be Jesus investing into the 12 who would invest into crowds, who would invest into 12, who would invest into crowds. This is the multiplication. Jesus prayerfully selected disciples whom he invited to join his mission. And then he turned more of his attention to them. I want to say something really clearly. This is powerful. One would think, and from a human perspective, without thinking this through, it would seem like, well, Jesus just limited his capacity. Because up until then, he was drawing, we just read, he's drawing crowds from the whole known world, at least his known world. They're coming from everywhere. And now instead of focusing on those crowds, he's going to focus on 12? Does that make sense? But here's what happens. When we narrow our focus and we know with a divine clarity what we're called to, instead of limiting us, it actually opens up the opportunities. It makes it clear what we're supposed to do. We experienced this a few years ago. I experienced this. I'll use I language. As I was stepping into the lead pastor role here at the church. I've been on staff for many years, but I was stepping into a different role here as Pastor Tri and Nancy were shifting out of directly leading the church. And I was praying for clarity about what God would have for us. And at the time, and I can't go into the whole story, but to make a long story short, I recognized that God had placed us in Garden City. We're a church that's in Garden City. We're called Vineyard Boise. We didn't start in Garden City. This is the campus that we landed on pretty early, that was miraculously provided by God. But we were in Garden City, and up until that point, I had sort of come to honestly despise Garden City. I thought, we're buried back here in an industrial district. We're hidden. The busiest road in the state of Idaho is right out there, or at least one of the busiest roads at the time. Eagle's probably more busy now. It's hell. Sorry, that was just spontaneous. If you live in Eagle, I'm sorry. But Chinden was just this, and yet we were hidden. We were removed off of Chinden in this industrial area. People couldn't find us. And it was this, and so all these dynamics had led to me kind of having a posture towards Garden City that was like, I wish we weren't here. I wish we were, up in a more visible place, maybe more like Calvary Chapel. I had location envy because they had this great spot right by the freeway, and God began to break my heart, and I share the story in our 101, but God, in an epiphany that happened in my truck, God reminded me that he had placed us here. That we weren't here because of human decision, that he had sovereignly, miraculously placed us in Garden City. And that we were to not limit ourselves to focusing on Garden City, but we were always supposed to start with seeking the transformation of Garden City. To seek to be light in Garden City. To seek to love the city effectively. And so, it narrowed my focus, and so here's how that played out. When I was a youth pastor, I literally had kids in every school, every private school, public school, charter school, homeschool. We had kids in every single school across the valley. And, stretching out to Mountain Home and going to Emmett, Horseshoe Bend, we had kids everywhere. So I was never involved in any one school because how could I? Our kids were scattered all over. But when I stopped asking the question about where were our kids, but instead where had God called us to love the city, it made it very clear. There's one school that serves Garden City, one primary public school that serves Garden City, and it's Whittier Elementary. And so that's when we began, we just came through Christmas where we did this massive project for the faculty and the families and the students at Whittier. That emerged out of this moment of clarity where we said, you know what? Instead of trying to focus on every school in the valley, let's focus on the one next to us. So we narrowed our focus, and it opened wide the opportunity. Had it not been for narrowing our focus, we would have never started all of those projects. We would have never started reaching out to them, and the countless stories that we've heard of kids whose hearts were touched, teachers and families whose hearts were touched by the generous love of God extended through his church. So here's my point. Sometimes you've got all this opportunity in front of you, and when you narrow the focus to here's what I'm supposed to do, it makes it really clear. Jesus had all this opportunity in front of him. The human need was vast. The people were coming. But he said, I'm going to focus on these 12. And the power of that shift is the fact that we're here today, 2,000 years later. That Jesus' mission didn't stop with his death, his earthly death, that the mission continued because he'd invested into others who would invest into others. What was the last line? It said that he made them in order that they might be with him and that they may be sent out. He was sending others with the message and the mission. What did it look like? He invited them into an intentional, active lifestyle of discipleship. No longer just come to an event and listen to me speak, or come to an event and watch me multiply food, come to an event and watch me heal people. He said, I want you more of your lives. I want a whole lifestyle of discipleship. Their lives as his disciples would be organized around these three intertwining rhythms that we just saw there in the text. It was a relational rhythm, a transformational rhythm, and a missional one. The relational one was that they might be with him. He said, I'm going to continue to do, public events. We see Jesus still speaking in places. But he said, I'm going to give more of my time to you. There's going to be a relational agreement between us that we're doing this thing together. There's going to be clarity. Jesus says, you're the 12 that I want to do my life with. Would you like to do that with me? That they might be with him. There was a transformational rhythm that they were going to be made to become his apostles. This is the fact that Jesus was going to form his image in them. So that what they carried out when they went on mission is that they carried his image. And lastly, there was a missional rhythm, that it wasn't just about we're going to come together and we're going to have this really neat community, but there was always going to be an outward focus to it. We're going to come together and we're going to have this great community, but then we're going to go out to transform the world. We're going to go share the love of Jesus and the power of Jesus with other people. That's what it looked like for them. So we go on to find out who he appointed. He appointed the 12, Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, James, the son of Zebedee, John, the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, that is, the sons of thunder, Andrew and Philip, that's their cage fight name, sons of thunder. Andrew and Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. This is interesting because Jesus, he chose very ordinary people. He didn't choose the most likely candidates for entrusting his mission to. He didn't go to their religious schools of the day and ask for their top candidates for the cream of the crop, for the top 10% of their theological classes. In fact, in our devotions this week, Pastor Mike pointed out that, in fact, these people were probably the spiritual rejects from being able to be disciples of a rabbi. Instead, they were just told, why don't you go do blue-collar type things, like fish or collect taxes? You're not really cut out for this spiritual stuff. He chose ordinary people with various backgrounds, vocationally and ideologically. He chose people from opposite sides of the political spectrum. Just in that list of 12, we know that Matthew was a traitor to the nation of Israel, while Simon was a patriot, to use our language. We had a patriot and a traitor. And while they did not all have the same human ambitions, they were all driven by human ambition. We know that Judas was greedy for financial gain. Why was he there? He stole from the common purse. He took a bribe for betrayal. Maybe he saw that following Jesus would possibly be a financial payoff. We know that Simon the Zealot likely saw Jesus as the political Messiah that he longed for. We'll see in the coming chapters that James and John were after political power and political position. And that when they let that be known, the others were jealous that they had asked for it first. So Jesus picked people who were not yet perfect, who were in the process of sanctification, but here's what they were. They were willing to follow. And when invited into this relationship of transformation, of lifestyle discipleship, they were willing to say yes. Jesus was looking for people who were in process and willing to have the humility to say, I need to grow to be more like you. Again, 2,000 years later, the continuing mission of Jesus' followers throughout the generations speaks to the effectiveness of Jesus' model, of his pivot and adapt moment. But the church throughout the generations has had seasons of crisis when it was time to pivot and adapt once again, to adopt our models. And I believe that we're in one of those seasons right now. It's a season that we've been in, and it's become increasingly clear through 2020 and everything that we've experienced with pandemic and quarantine and everything that 2020 brought us. So here's our ministry crisis. It doesn't look exactly the same as Jesus, although there's a lot of parallels. Let me just describe a few of them, and this is not a comprehensive list. You'll notice that at the bottom it says the last one has ... because I could list our crisis for a long time and just make you very, very depressed, which you probably don't need, right? But let's talk about a few of them. And we're talking about from a church perspective. I would say most all of these challenges for the Church of North America pre-existed COVID, but these were accelerated and intensified over the last year. Some of these challenges were exposed by what happened with COVID and quarantine and by what's happening in our world. It exposed the nature of some challenges that we were up against that require us to adapt and change. And when I'm speaking to this in North America, I'm speaking specifically to the model of the church as organized around the Sunday gathering or event. Oftentimes when people talk about church, they talk about a building and a time. Talk about what church do you go to? Well, I go to the Vineyard and it happens on Sunday morning at 10 o'clock. That's church as a place and a time. And you see what Jesus was doing is he was moving away from that. He was moving away from event-driven things. And he was still going to do the events, but he said the true power lies in something different, in a whole lifestyle that's not limited to an event or a place, but a whole lifestyle. So challenge of belonging. When we are isolated, socially distanced, limited in gathering size, and yet we're called to belong to a spiritual family. What does it mean to be the church? It doesn't mean that you go to a building or you have an affiliation with a specific group. It means you belong to a spiritual family. And so many over the last year, and in the years leading up to this last year, but it's been intensified, have experienced, I don't feel like I belong. Yeah, I can come and sit in a building, and I can listen to a monologue, but I don't feel like I belong to a spiritual family. Many feel invisible, disconnected, isolated, unneeded, and it's so easy to simply drift away. There's so many. This is true of us as a specific congregation. It's true of the church throughout North America. There's so many pastors we're in dialogues and we're trying to say, how do we do this thing? Because it feels like everyone's drifting away when people can't gather. Maybe people we're being limited by our health authorities. We're being limited by our own concerns and our own need to protect our vulnerability or protect others. And so many people are simply drifting away in isolation. So there's a challenge of belonging, there's a challenge of communicating. Right now we have so many ways to communicate that it's actually really hard to communicate. It was actually much easier when you had a landline telephone and that was it. Because now we've got 1,000 ways to communicate and 1,000 ways that people want to personally receive their communication. Some of you will never read your email, some of you will only read your email. Some of you will only read Facebook, some of you will only be on Instagram, some of you have abandoned those to other, forums. Some people want hard letters, some people want phone calls, some people like text. It's really hard to communicate these days. When you're trying to communicate to crowds, it's really hard to communicate and know if you actually reach the mark because it's like shouting into a vacuum. Did they hear it? So we've experienced this year different times when we've had to make sudden changes that we couldn't communicate for weeks on end. Like there was a time where we had to close the campus and say, this weekend we're going to be virtual only because we've had a COVID exposure and an outbreak amongst our leadership team. And so we've got to go virtual only this weekend. And we blitzed every form of communication for 3 days that we knew how to. And still, many people never heard the message and showed up thinking there was going to be church. Okay, that's a communication problem. That's a communication challenge because you just don't know who to communicate to. There's a challenge of tribalism. Tribalism when people distrust, when they distance themselves, and when they protect themselves from the other. And whenever it doesn't matter what the other is, but if I identify with this group, with this political persuasion, with this cause, with this religious affiliation, with this, whatever the bent is. And right now in our world, we all know this, everybody's polarized, and if you're not in my group, you're not trusted. And that's affected the church. This challenge of discipling, such a limited model with so much competition for our formation. So when I talk about a model in which the primary expression of church is a Sunday gathering that might have other elements as well, but the primary thing is what happens on Sunday, that's a very limited model, because how much formation of our lives to be like Jesus can happen in an hour and a half when we're spending so much other time out there? I mean, there's a lot of other days and hours of the week, isn't there? Right now, I think the most grievous condition of the church is that we're more formed by our news source and by our social media than we are by Jesus. That's the sad state of the church. And as long as we settle for a model of church that is organized around an event, we're going to continue to get that. The question is, it's the anemicness of our discipleship. And when I say discipleship, I mean becoming like Jesus. The anemicness of our discipleship is exposed in the way that we carry ourselves in the world and in what we're known for. And when the world thinks about Christians, if they don't think about a people that selflessly lay down their lives for the sake of others, then we're not imaging Jesus in the way he intended. Jesus came into this world to lay down his life for the sake of others, not to take up his rights. He actually laid down his rights in order to love others well. I don't care what your persuasion is about anything. That's what the world's supposed to see when they see Christians. A people who radically and generously love one another and who radically and generously love their enemies. Anybody can love a friend. It's easy. Loving our enemies is divine. The challenge of discipling, I think our discipleship's been exposed. I'm not just talking about us, I'm just saying big picture. These are some broad sweeping generalizations, but everybody generalizes, so it's okay. But here's the question: is Christ in fact being formed in us? Are we faithfully carrying his image into the world? There's the challenge of being missional. When people are distancing from events and from one another, in the past, we've relied on events to be missional. Think about all the events that we do, that we bring people here, we plan this big event, and we use it as a way to communicate the gospel. When that works and when that's available, it's great. This year, we have canceled so many of our things that we had planned. When we sat down and we did a planning for 2020, we planned so many things, and almost all of them got canceled. And the ones we still did, we had to pivot and adapt. And we had to do them very differently. But if we could narrow our mission, could we refocus and still have great clarity and intentionality and even effectiveness in our mission? I would suggest yes. And lastly, and this one's just personal, it's pastoral care. When people are so scattered, when we don't have clarity of who to care for, who we're responsible for, the care net has many holes and many people fall through. Here's the challenge of being a pastor in 2020. I have no idea how the church is doing. For many people, for those who come on campus, we at least get to see each other. When we see each other, there's a sense in which I can tell this person's in crisis. But right now, we're so scattered with the majority of our church gathering virtually, we don't know who's out there on the other side of that camera. We don't know how they're doing. We don't know if they're isolated. We don't know if they've drifted away. We don't know what one another's needs are. That's a very limited model. So what is our pivot and adapt? We're doing the same thing as Jesus. It's time for us to reset our ministry model in order to meet the present needs and to prepare for the future advancement of God's mission. We need to refocus our energy. We need to rearrange our priorities. We need to reorganize our lives. And we need to release others to join the mission. What we need is a whole church of people who know who our 12 is. So we've got great clarity about who we're communicating with, who we're caring for, who we're doing mission with, who we're becoming more like Jesus with. That there's a community for that. That was Jesus' model. And so the mother of invention for us, necessity is the mother of invention. It's not to create something brand new. It's to just rewind and go back to what Jesus did. Jesus said, and let me be really clear, Jesus kept doing events. He kept preaching in the synagogue. He kept speaking on the mountainside. He kept going from town to town and But the focus of his discipleship energies was on those 12 and what they would do. As a church, it's time for us to not just be a church that has small groups on the side, but to organize and invest a lot of our energy into what happens in the small group. And so we're rebranding what we would call small groups historically. We're going to be calling them life groups because they're not about events, they're about our whole lives. Here's our ministry, Pivot Adapt. We're investing into an intentional, active lifestyle of discipleship organized around an identified circle with clarity about 3 practices or rhythms. So here's those 3 same intertwining rhythms. Jesus, we saw him right there in that paragraph, a rhythm that's relational, transformational, and missional. This means that we have to adapt our model to that the weight of our discipleship is not shouldered by the Sunday event. The weight of our discipleship is shouldered by what happens in groups. We will have both. The question is, which one shoulders the weight? Which one do we invest into clarity and energy? Which one can work when we continue to experience the limitations of the moment that we're in? Small groups can adapt. Life groups can meet virtually some weeks and in person other weeks. They can quickly communicate with each other. They can let each other know when there's a need. They can care for one another. They can go on mission together. So this is not like a brand new, wow, like crazy. We've never seen that. It's the emphasis. Church cannot be about a Sunday event. If church for you is a Sunday event that you attend and spectate or participate in some way, but that's the limits of it, we're going to miss the mission. We're going to spend the next 3 weeks unpacking those 3 rhythms. So this is not a comprehensive message. This is sort of a launch point. We're going to spend the next 3 weeks looking at each one of those rhythms individually. Relational, transformational, missional. What does that mean? And we're going to try and bring clarity to those things because many of us are already in small groups. If you're already in a small group, wonderful. What we want to do is give you great clarity about those. Jesus organized his group around 3 things: relational, missional, transformational. And we want to look at those 3 things and say, are we doing each one of those 3 things? Let's have great clarity about that, about who we're doing it with, what we're doing, what we're trying to accomplish. And by narrowing our focus, I think we're going to be a lot more effective. By narrowing our focus, we're actually going to have clarity about what we should do and feel a lot less lost in the middle of this. For those who don't yet belong to a small group, we're going to launch a bunch of life groups at the end of January, on the final Sunday of January. There's 5 Sundays in January. Here's Jesus spent a whole night in prayer. It took us more prayer than what it did Jesus. But we've been praying a lot. Starting with our whole vision retreat was just saturated in prayer, praying, God, would you show us the way forward? Would you show us what our pivot and adapt moment looks like? And after that, we've been praying for, God, who are the leaders that you want us to empower? And what we recognize is we've got a church full of people that are not perfect and have their own agendas, and just like Jesus picked, and are from both sides of the political spectrum, just like Jesus experienced. But we've been looking for people that are authentic and maturing disciples who have the capacity to encourage and equip others in their discipleship. And we've said, would you start a small group? Would you start a life group? And we'll talk about how those things are going to work and how they're going to be organized. But here's the win for me. If every person who calls Vineyard Boise home knows who their 12 is, and 12 is not literal, it might be 4 or 5 or 8, but probably can't handle much more than 12. If Jesus capped it at 12, we should probably recognize our own limitations. If everybody had that, and they were doing discipleship, and were intentionally pursuing transformation to be more like Jesus, and knew who they were responsible to care for, and knew who they were going to go on mission with, that would be an incredibly powerful thing. I'll close with this. It's just a picture. This is from my office. I've been on staff here for 22 years now. And Andrea bought this plant for me when I got my very first office. I've had, I think, 6 or 7 offices here on campus now. This plant moves with me to each one. It started off, it was about this tall with 3 little shoots. That included the pot that it was in. Now, if I was reach my hand, I wouldn't be able to reach the top of it because it's grown. I want you to notice something. I took the picture from up above because every one of those 3 stalks has a bent in it. And it always bends towards the sun, towards the light. And they're held together. Those stalks are actually held together by a little piece of organic jute. But each one of them is growing towards the sun. If you were to look in the soil beneath them, they're inseparable. The roots are all bound up together. They look like 3 distinct things, and they're also one. That's been replanted multiple times in different pots. The leaves that you see there in that picture are not the leaves you would have seen last year because those leaves have fallen off and new ones have come. This is organic. And I was praying in my office this week, and I was just facing that tree, and I just realized that's just an organic picture of what we're pursuing. We're pursuing something that's living, something that does, in fact, at times get pruned and continues to grow. Something that's rooted together but has these 3 elements: relational, transformational, missional. The smallest one of those, the one that's on the bottom there, it's small because somebody broke it off. Seriously. Somebody was playing a practical joke on me one year and they broke my tree. And I couldn't take it out because I didn't know how to take it out without killing the other part. So I just left the empty stalk there. And then about a year later, it started growing again. And it grew a brand new shoot. There's things that have been broken off from us. And because we're a people of the living God, God will continue to bring growth if we continue to pursue him, if we continue to follow his lead, if we pray and ask for direction, and then we respond to what he says. So that plant gives me hope. So it's just a little parable of discipleship. And I want to close in prayer, and here's what I want to ask. Here's my ask for you. We're done for the morning. We had some ministry time. If you want prayer, if you didn't receive prayer this morning, we had some ministry time already, but if you still need prayer, you can email prayer@vineyardboise.org, and we'd love to pray with you. But here's my ask for you. Would you come for the next 3 weeks, and let's explore these 3 rhythms together? Because these are timely, they're appropriate for the moment in which we live, and they're rooting into what Jesus did, and they're very relevant for us as 21st century Americans, Christians. So we're going to lean into those. And would you be asking, God, would you show me, in the same way that Jesus prayed and the Father gave him clarity and said, these are your 12? Would you pray that over the next 4 weeks, if you're not already part of a life group, or, again, we're rebranding them to be called life groups, so you may not know that you're in a life group, but if you know who your 12 are, great. But would you ask for clarity about what it looks like? What does discipleship look like in this moment as it relates to these 3 rhythms of discipleship? And if you're not in one, then would you ask God to provide and show the way forward? Lord Jesus, as we see you in this moment where you adapted to the things that were happening around you, that you were not shaped by them, but you were relevant to them. And you stepped out in a new way, and you entrusted others with your mission. And Lord, because of that, the mission has continued and your gospel has expanded. So Lord, would you do that once again? Would you give us clarity about the moment we live in and the challenges that we face? Would you give us clarity about the challenges so that we can step into them in faith and with wisdom and with power? Lord, I pray for that thing that happened when we focused on Garden City and it gave us clarity and showed us the opportunity that was in front of us. As we consider what it would look like to focus our whole life on doing life with a life group of people, would you show us what the opportunities are? Would you appoint relationships? Lord, in the same way that we've seen you appoint things that we could not have orchestrated. We can't orchestrate this. We don't know the way forward. We're simply trying to follow your lead. And so would you orchestrate and appoint and clarify? And would you breathe upon this by the power of your Holy Spirit that your church would be relevant and effective in joining your mission together in this moment. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. All right, church, go out and make the invisible God visible.
Thanks for watching. To respond or receive prayer after the live stream closes, please email prayer@vineyardboise.org, and if possible, include your phone number. We'd love to get in touch with you. Thanks.